The Tale of Jane, Resilience Amidst Family Betrayal. Welcome to Life Tells Stories, where we bring you raw, untold tales that will move you, inspire you, and sometimes shock you. Today, we have an emotional roller coaster that unfolds in the midst of a family event. An incident that brings out betrayal, heartbreak, and ultimately, a powerful sense of resilience. Have you ever felt like you were invisible within your own family, treated like an outsider while others thrived in the spotlight? If so, this story might resonate deeply with you. Our story begins at a wedding. Not just any wedding, but the grand celebration of a sister who has always been considered the pride of the family. Meet Jane, a 21-year-old factory worker on the night shift, who arrives at her sister Stella's wedding only to discover she has been given a table all by herself. A large round table, empty except for Jane. The sight of the other tables bustling with laughter, conversation, and joy made the isolation even more unbearable. Jane could see her parents laughing, her sister surrounded by her friends, and every familiar face she had known growing up. Except none of them turned towards her. No one asked her to join them. While others mingle and celebrate, Jane sits isolated, feeling the weight of judgment pressing down on her as if her worth were nothing more than her high school diploma. Just as she is trying to swallow her pain, someone approaches. A man, well-dressed and gentle in demeanor, stands in front of her table with a plate of food and a drink in his hand. "Excuse me, may I join you?" he asks with a kind smile. Jane nods, somewhat surprised, and the man takes a seat. Who could it be, and how will this twist her fate? To understand how Jane ended up at that lonely table, we must go back to her life at home. Her family has always revolved around Stella, the golden child. Stella is celebrated for her intelligence, charisma, and success, while Jane has been treated as the family servant. Jane's mother, an overbearing figure who refuses to let Jane pursue her education, calls her worthless. Her father, though aware of the cruelty, remains passive, unwilling to confront his wife. The golden child, Stella, was always put on a pedestal. She excelled in school, and her parents proudly boasted about her achievements to anyone who would listen. Jane, on the other hand, had dreams of her own. She wasn't a poor student. In fact, she liked studying. But when it came time for high school, her mother refused to let her go, calling it a waste of money. Jane worked the night shift at a factory, giving all her earnings to her parents, and still woke up early every day to cook and clean. Jane's father, although he sometimes tried to show kindness, was too timid to ever take her side. "Your mother doesn't listen to anyone," he once said, after a half-hearted attempt to argue in Jane's favor. Jane had to suppress her desires, ambitions, and needs for years. Stella was the shining star, and Jane was the shadow, existing only to make her sister look brighter. The harsh reality of her family's dynamic was something Jane endured every single day, and her role as the scapegoat was never more apparent than on Stella's wedding day. Jane finds solace in an unlikely companion, her cat, Susie. Brought home because Stella wanted a pet, Susie quickly becomes Jane's responsibility when Stella loses interest. Jane's parents viewed Susie as nothing more than a temporary amusement for Stella, and when Stella got bored, they no longer paid the cat any mind. But for Jane, Susie was everything. Susie offered warmth where her family was cold. Every morning when Jane came home exhausted from her night shift, Susie would be there at the door, her tail flicking with happiness, ready to greet her. During Jane's teenage years, when the weight of her family's disdain seemed almost too much to bear, Susie was her one source of comfort. When Jane sat alone in her room, tears streaming down her face, Susie would jump into her lap, purring as if to say, "I'm here." This little creature, who needed Jane just as much as Jane needed her, gave Jane a reason to keep going. One evening, Stella comes home with exciting news. She's getting married to Brian, a charming, wealthy coworker who adores her. While the family celebrates, Jane feels more isolated than ever. Brian's arrival to their home is another moment for Stella to flaunt her superiority. During their introduction, Brian openly mocks Jane for her factory job and education. He views her as an embarrassment, a belief shared by Jane's entire family. As Stella gushed about Brian, his successful job, his wealth, and how much he adored her, Jane listened in silence. It wasn't long before Stella began making snide remarks. "You know, Jane," she said, "Brian would probably help you find a better job if you had a high school diploma. But oh well, it's too late now." Jane wanted to disappear, to escape the constant belittling. But instead, she simply forced a smile and walked away. The family continued celebrating, drinking champagne, and laughing, while Jane was left cleaning up the mess they made. The announcement of Stella's engagement felt like another reminder of just how alone Jane was in that house. She had no one who would celebrate her victories, no matter how small. Stella's wedding became the focus of the entire family, and Jane, once again, was left in the shadows. The story takes a shocking turn just days before Stella's wedding. Brian, it turns out, is allergic to cats. Jane comes home after a long night shift to discover her parents' scratched hands. They coldly inform her that Susie has been abandoned in the mountains, left alone because Stella's wedding comes first. The pain of losing Susie overwhelms Jane. Susie was her reason for staying in that toxic house, and now she's gone, dumped without a second thought. Jane's entire world shatters in that moment. She screams, her voice echoing through the walls of a house that had never heard her speak up before. Years of pent-up pain and anger boil over as she confronts her family. Her mother, though startled at Jane's outburst, responds coldly, "It's just a cat, Jane. Stella is getting married. You should be happy for your sister." Even Brian chimes in, smirking, "Seriously, it's just a cat. You're overreacting." Jane's sister rolls her eyes, clearly annoyed by Jane's emotional reaction. To them, Susie was nothing, a disposable inconvenience. But to Jane, Susie was her only family. The betrayal cut deeper than anything she had experienced before. It was in that moment that Jane realized she had to leave. There was nothing left for her in that house. Amidst all this turmoil, Jane's only pillar of support is Harry, her kind-hearted coworker. Harry has long been Jane's friend and confidant, encouraging her when her family tears her down. When Jane tells Harry what happened to Susie, he immediately comes to her aid. Together, they search the mountains for Susie, but hours pass without finding her. Jane, utterly broken, fears the worst. Harry sees firsthand the depth of Jane's suffering and makes a life-changing decision. He offers Jane a place to stay, a way out of her abusive home. Harry had always admired Jane's strength. Despite everything she had been through, she still showed up to work, still treated others with kindness, and still smiled when she could. Seeing her so shattered broke Harry's heart. He couldn't understand how anyone could treat Jane the way her family did. As they searched the dark, cold mountains, Harry vowed to himself that he would never let Jane go through something like this alone again. When they finally stopped searching, Harry turned to her and said, "You can't stay there anymore, Jane. Come with me. I'll help you start over." For Jane, it was the first lifeline she had ever been offered, and though she was scared, she knew she had to take it. The day of Stella's wedding finally arrives, and Jane is determined to attend, despite everything. This time, she isn't attending as the neglected sister. She has a purpose. As Jane arrives, dressed simply but with a new resolve, she is seated alone at the same table. Her family's intention to humiliate her once again is clear, but this time, Jane doesn't let it crush her. Instead, she waits, observing her family put on their false masks. When Brian's CEO, Paul, unexpectedly sits at her table, Jane realizes an opportunity has presented itself. As Jane and Paul talk, Jane is careful with her words, testing the waters to see how much she can reveal. She explains about Susie, how she was abandoned, how her sister and Brian made it happen, and how her family had laughed at her grief. As Jane watches Paul's reaction, she feels a sense of empowerment she's never felt before. The wedding, once a symbol of her insignificance, becomes the stage where she finally speaks up. During their conversation, Paul brings up cats, and Jane sees her chance. She reveals the truth about Susie, how Stella and Brian abandoned her in the mountains without a second thought. She explains that the photos of Susie Stella had shown Paul were not out of love, but lies. As Jane talks, her voice rises, and people begin to listen. Paul is visibly shaken by the story, furious at the couple's cruelty. At that moment, Stella and Brian approach, and Jane makes sure they hear every word. Paul stands up, his voice loud enough for others at the nearby tables to hear. "Is this true, Stella? Did you really abandon a helpless animal just because Brian is allergic?" Stella stammers, trying to come up with an excuse, but it's clear that the facade is crumbling. Brian tries to laugh it off, saying, "Oh, come on, it's just a joke." Jane is blowing everything out of proportion, but Paul isn't buying it. Jane, her heart pounding, pulls out her phone. She has a recording of her parents, Stella and Brian, discussing abandoning Susie. She plays it, and the room falls silent. The voices are unmistakable, the cruel words echoing throughout the reception hall. Take a moment to comment below. What would you do if you were in Jane's shoes? Do you think Stella and Brian deserve what's coming next? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Jane takes things a step further. She has a recording of her family discussing abandoning Susie. She plays it for Paul, and the entire room goes silent as the voices of her parents, Stella and Brian, echo in the hall. Paul, who had always thought Stella loved animals, is disgusted. Stella and Brian scramble to justify their actions, but the damage is done. Jane leaves the wedding with her head held high, vindicated, even if her heart still aches for Susie. Paul's reaction is swift. He turns to Stella and Brian, his voice cold. "I gave you responsibilities because I thought you cared, but it seems I was wrong. You're not the people I thought you were." Stella tries to plead. "Paul, please. It's not what it looks like." But Paul shakes his head. "I've heard enough." He turns and walks away, leaving Stella and Brian standing there, their faces pale. Jane can see her parents watching from across the room, their expressions a mix of shock and anger. But she doesn't care. For the first time in her life, she feels free. She walks out of the wedding, her head held high, knowing that she finally stood up for herself. After leaving the wedding, Jane moves in with Harry, leaving her toxic family behind. The relief is immense, and slowly, Jane begins to rebuild her life. Miraculously, a few weeks later, a kind stranger finds Susie near a pet cemetery and brings her back. It feels like a piece of her heart has returned. Meanwhile, Jane's family is facing their downfall. Stella and Brian's relationship crumbles, and they both lose their jobs due to the scandal. Jane's father finally divorces her mother, but Jane has no intention of looking back. Harry's small apartment quickly becomes a place of warmth and safety for Jane. He makes sure she knows she's welcome, that she has a place where she can rest and heal. They spend their evenings together, cooking dinner, watching movies, and laughing. Things that Jane never thought she could have. When Susie is found, it feels like a miracle. Jane cries as she holds her beloved cat, vowing to never let her out of her sight again. It's the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter filled with love, hope, and freedom. Meanwhile, back at her old home, things fall apart. Stella moves back in with her parents after her breakup with Brian, her job gone, her reputation destroyed. Jane's father finally finds the courage to leave her mother, but Jane feels nothing for them anymore. This story is a powerful reminder of how far some people will go to protect their pride while trampling on others. Jane's journey from being the ignored sister to standing up for herself and seeking justice is one that many can relate to. It's a story about resilience, about the people who step into our lives when we need them the most and help us find our strength. It's also about the power of truth and how it can bring down even the most arrogant individuals who think they can get away with anything. If you enjoyed this story, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to Life Tells Stories for more true tales of courage, redemption, and justice. We're always here to share stories that speak to the resilience of the human spirit. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and never forget, your worth is not determined by what others say about you. Thank you for watching.